Howdy, howdy, and welcome to the Outside In podcast. Today, we're talking about the differences in civil and criminal digital forensics with Jordan McQuown, the CIO for ISC Management Services. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. Jordan, welcome to the Outside In podcast. How's it going today?
It's been a great day, rainy day here in Atlanta.
Excellent. So today we brought you in to talk about digital forensics and more specifically the differences between civil and criminal forensics cases. But before we jump into that, like I said, I'll be the first to stumble. But before we jump into that, I'm hoping you give us a little bit of your background in forensics and why it's a topic that you're really passionate about.
Yeah, for sure, Brad. So from a forensics perspective, I've been working in the e-discovery, legal technology, and forensics field since about 2013. I've seen quite a few different styles of cases, matters, things that start forensics, go to discovery, up even through data breach investigations that I've worked. So I've kind of touched on almost every aspect of legal spectrum in the forensic space. So I'm passionate because it's a very important thing for us to do in the space of what we support here in the legal world.
Excellent. And what are you, is your current role at IST?
I am the CIO and CISO. So on that same note, forensics is important to me from a security perspective. You know, if we ever needed to go down that road, we need to make sure we understand what evidence exists and what we needed to plan for in our own environments.
Perfect. I think you just started to touch on evidence there, and that really gets us started. So can you establish what the differences are between a civil and criminal investigation?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing when we talk about the differences in those two areas of law would really be the standard of care. So from a civil burden of proof, it's certainly relaxed in regards to criminal, which also means that the amount of evidence or the care that's taken and how you preserve, what you preserve, and how wide you cast that net in a criminal matter is typically more important. Secondarily, the types of evidence, it probably differentiates pretty significantly between criminal and civil. From a criminal investigation, everybody carries their cell phone. So the ability to get everything from that cell phone is far more important than getting a very small subset, which is what you typically see in say, a civil matter.
Excellent. So now that we kind of got a little understanding of how those differ, how does it differ for that forensics analysis person that's collecting that? What did they have to do differently in a civil case versus a criminal case?
From the scientific process, it needs to be the same, right? It needs to be a repeatable process that we do time and time again. And if you did it a second time, the results would have to maintain. So I think from an analyst perspective, it's not that so much what they would do differently, it's what they would do with the evidence once they actually captured and acquired it to work to prove whatever their case is or whatever the matter at hand. I think from a criminal perspective, it's more so the proverbial no stone left unturned. Mm-hmm. Whereas in a civil, you have a very specific area of information typically looking at, whether it be like some sort of business contract communication. Whereas again, in that criminal world, it could be location data. It could be a very large subset of information to put somebody at a place or, a certain event in time.
I would have to assume in that criminal world, that evidence is being collected from law enforcement, where in the civil world it's being collected possibly from an actual vendor or the company. Is that correct?
Yes and no. I would say the law enforcement agencies, the federal and the state levels have definitely matured in their technology, right? It wasn't that long ago that I would consider the forensic space to be wild, wild west, and a lot of police departments or even state investigation departments weren't really equipped for it. Mm-hmm. But vendors have definitely came into space. There's definitely been funding to get those teams up to speed. So to answer your question, I would say in most cases, yes. Most of the criminal type evidence would be collected via, whether it be the police department, a state level investigation agency, or a federal. Or potentially they would outsource to a vendor that has specialty techniques that go outside of what a normal vendor would have.
You had kind of touched on earlier the standard of care. Can you kind of describe what that means?
Well, when I consider the standard of care, I would closely associate it to the burden of proof, right? And there's estimations on the burden of proof of what a criminal matter is versus a civil matter. When I really deem standard of care in that area, I'd really consider it to be whether we look at doing a partial collection, which, in a normal civil matter, you would do what we call a target collection. You don't want the whole computer You only want the user documents or something that the user would create. In a criminal matter, you probably want the whole computer to be able to see all of the events or all of the actions that that user took. Same with a cell phone. You want to be able to get to areas or data of that phone that you normally wouldn't need in a or general civil matter.
Got it. Excellent. Which kind of leads me into, you're talking about the jurisdiction around requesting information, that burden of care and everything. What's the difference that forensics analyst needs to know as they're attacking these two different types of cases to make sure they're imaging potential evidence accurately?
I think from an analyst perspective, if they understand what the pursuit is, the biggest thing would really be understanding what the information or what is the core of the matter at hand. And from there, your forensic analyst will be able to guide you through the process of what areas we need to scope. Like, do we need to capture this server that holds this data, or do we just need this cell phone, or do we need somebody's mobile device and say their laptop? As far as navigating that scope, while we're starting to get into some privacy regulation in the US, there hasn't been a whole lot that pushes back on privacy when it comes to litigation in the US. Overseas, that's a different story. And that gets a little bit, I would say, more of a hairy situation in that citizens can push back and say, you can't have my data. It is mine under privacy regulation. That is their right, which will definitely puts an interest into investigations when you only have a subset of information.
Yeah, and I think you touched on something really great there, in that the laws are changing rapidly around all of this. And obviously, collection's been something that's happened forever in litigation, but as we've had an increase in digital information, we're seeing a lot more about that. So what are the advantages of companies, law firms, companies, agencies investing with a forensic vendor to ensure that they're doing these correctly?
So I think that's a multi-part question with a multi-part answer. The first answer I would give you is there's a lot of forensics work that has more to do with data security, data breach investigation that, honestly, that's the hottest topic. I think if we look at a forensic search for forensics in Google, and almost everything will tie back to hacking, it'll tie back to incident response, it'll tie back to data breach. Whereas the area that we work in is pretty specific in that it's more to investigations of malpractice or fraud or something that's more closely related to the legal industry. So getting back to your question, I think investing in a forensics vendor who knows specifically the area of the law you're working in and that focuses specifically in those areas of collection, examination, is important, because not all evidence is the same. Not all matters are the same. Data breach is a very distinct practice in forensics, whereas the area of, cell phone examination and computer examination for different files and different types of artifacts is different. And I also think the other thing that should be considered when you're investing in a forensics team or a forensics partner, if they understand your practice, your business, the areas that you work in, you spend a lot less time with them in scoping and getting understanding and getting to the data sets that you need to carry on your matters. So it's similar to taking a trusted partner. They understand what you need. You understand what they're going to give you. It's a better relationship.
Yeah, hacking's obviously the thing you see in all the movies and the TV shows and the person you're right. It's the exciting thing. But I would think most of whether it is a civil or criminal case, is really just trying to collect information on somebody's phone, computer, hard drive that's talking about whatever the belief is that they did wrong.
Yeah, I mean, a majority of electronic evidence in these civil matters is going to be office productivity type of docs, emails, some types of CRMs. Now, with that being stated, since I started in this area in the 2013-ish, there's been a lot of new evidence sources, and that's not going to stop. Obviously, mobile devices have increased in proliferation. They've increased in business transactions. It's really a part of not only personal life, but it's a part of everyday business life. And so have SaaS applications out there. I think the biggest difference between hacking is really the target. So from a data breach investigation, you're really focusing on how they got into your system and then what they did afterwards. Whereas with your traditional litigation, you're looking more at user actions as it relates to documents or some form of a scheme or evidence of what they did versus, I guess it's really just different targets, really different angles.
Right, just having that analyst that knows how to differentiate whether this is a civil or criminal, and then the different layers of that inside there to be able to apply the right type of searches on there.
And focus exactly on the data that you need, not necessarily all the noise of, because there's a lot of noise in electronic evidence.
I mean, just a single email chain can have branched in 40 different ways and have so many CCs, and you're really only looking for that one needle in the haystack. Kind of I liked what you touched on there is all the new data sources that are coming in. Forever, collections and litigation was based on almost a more physical type of evidence, and now it's going digital. How do you make sure, as a company and a firm that specializes in this, that your people are up to date on how to be able to collect in all these different worlds?
Yeah, that's a really tough question to answer. Obviously before there was an E in discovery, it was paper-based discovery, and people had papers, boxes everywhere. And, how do you know you have everything that you have? That's a great question, right? When it gets to electronic evidence, obviously through a scoping process, questionnaire, understanding how businesses interact and how people communicate, and the matter at hand, you can start to scope in on what systems need to be collected. But as you mentioned, with proliferation of cloud services, software as a service, and everything being cloud web-based, where does that data actually reside? That's where we have to rely pretty heavily on our partners that have the tools to be able to go through these obscure systems. So, Microsoft SharePoint, Microsoft Teams, they're not obscure, they're not new, but ultimately they continuously evolve. So while they're not new products, the way that you get data from them changes. It can be weekly, daily, monthly, same with Twitter or Facebook, you name it. So we really have to rely on our partners to give us the strong products to allow our analysts to focus on understanding where the evidence is and understanding how to analyze the evidence, not as much on collecting it. Our analysts need to understand how to, or where to collect it, and what tools they can use to get to it, so they can, obviously consult with our client base. But for the most part, we're really relying on our partners for that.
Excellent. And you talked earlier about privacy and also all the new data sources. And I mean, I got my laptop here, I got my cell phone in my pocket. They're both company phones, but they're also personal phones. And I liked earlier you said in the criminal world, it's about collecting everything. In the civil world, it's about more targeted. But how does that conversation go when you're working with a law firm on what to target and what to get, now that it's so murky between what's business and what's private?
Yeah, that's not a one-size-fits-all question. From a collection or targeted collection perspective, first and foremost, it is hard to get people to give up their phones to do a collection. First off, nobody wants to show up to a physical location, or nobody wants to ship their phone for 2 days. It's almost like it's a life or death device that sits in your pocket that, it's debatable whether it's life or death. And sometimes I wish they weren't invented, but here we are. So with that being stated, traditionally speaking, they'll have an idea of who the communications were with, or, what specifically types of information are looking at. So most times you're carving out a very small subsection of that data that you're sending off. As a human being, if my phone were to be investigated, there's, conversations with friends and family that honestly, not a big deal, but would I want that information being read by a third party? No. In the same way, we have to take those same concerns, and I think the law firms and the legal practice in general is very sensitive to those same privacy concerns. We're here to do a job, to do the best we can. There's going to be mistakes that are being made, but we try to do our best to use that scalpel and cut as close as we can.
I like what you're talking about, where people don't want to give up that cell phone for whatever reason. It's my life. I can't be without it for 2 days. It's an inconvenience to go there. But it opens up another door in the fact that I'd assume in a criminal, a hold's put on information. It's a lot more difficult for that user to manipulate or try and remove stuff or whatever. Or in a civil, there's probably a lot more of that. How are y'all able to tell if data's been deleted, been moved, there's issues with that collection that don't seem to fit right?
So a lot of the software and applications that we use, it'll tell us if there's issues and where there's issues, so you can do some manual examination. I think one of the things to reference there when you talk about the forfeiture of devices, and depending on your statute, right, Forfeiture in criminal cases is pretty easy. It's just
Right.
take. Civil cases, it's kind of like, hey, can you please show up, and can
Right.
you please, hand over the device? We need this to happen. We're fortunate that most of our cell phone collection at this point is done remotely, so we don't actually burden anybody to come in. It's, it's just something that we can do remotely without them really having to do much,
Okay.
which I think has helped the process. That has evolved significantly over the last few years. But as far as what you're talking about with deleted evidence, it's always it's a tough situation. There's definitely forensic artifacts that are left behind when files are deleted. Sometimes they can be recovered, what was actually deleted. Sometimes you can only see that the files or directories were deleted. Sometimes there's evidence of programs that were run to cover these tracks. In a cell phone, it's a lot harder just because it's not really a full operating system and they only allow you to have what you have.
Right.
There are, again, specialty softwares out there that will allow you to be able to get more data or get a better read on the file system. And sometimes they work on specific phones and sometimes they don't. So there's really not a one size fits all. And I will say, from my perspective, Apple has continued to push that privacy side of things, where like their text messaging databases and whatnot are supposed to be encrypted, and like things like Signal and WhatsApp, where they are encrypted messages, it gets, again, if people are using those, it's a lot harder to get to. Not possible, just a lot harder. And then you have to ask yourself, is it worth it?
Right.
Is it worth it for what's at stake?
And so let's say the firm says it is worth it, and we're seeing this track that, okay, the data has been deleted or moved. This is just an assumption on my part. But if you're able to see what that file history is, that would then allow that forensic analysis person to be able to say, well, we couldn't get it from here, but it's in Outlook, so we can go over here to get it off of somebody else's phone or computer. Or is that not true?
In the world of CSI, that is true.
In the world of CSI, that is true.
In the real world, when you delete something, depending on the file system that it's running on, you may see a record to where that data exists, and you may actually be able to get all the data.
Right.
It does allow you to paint a picture or to tell a narrative in that we know that the files existed, we know what their file names were, and you may be able to go in what's called slack space, which is space that's been deleted but not cleared, and get references or information from that file or from that data source. But it's not always a clear cut, I can now just take this and go over here. Like, from an SMS perspective, I might be able to go to, say, your Apple device and pull your iMessage history if it's not on your phone, or I might be able to go to iCloud and pull it. From a Windows world or an email world, it gets a little bit harder, but again, a lot of people are in Office 365. There is a hidden recovery bin. There's a lot of areas, recycle bins that files can sit. And honestly, I think what I'm trying to get to is, in most cases, good bits of information can be recovered, but depending on the technical capabilities of the person who owns the devices, it's certainly possible that it's never coming back.
Got it. Perfect. We've talked a lot about privacy and change, and obviously in today's remote hybrid workplace, there's been a lot of monitoring tools that companies are releasing onto, whether it's tracking you through the camera or it's tracking your keystroke. How has this complicated or made easier that job for that analysis person in a criminal or civil case?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think from a monitoring perspective, I'm not sure it's really made it easier. So there's definitely a lot of tools that will track history and track evidence, and it uses similar evidence sources or similar types that a forensic analyst can pull together. So I think the biggest gain out of that would be more so it has more evidence that you can use to tell the story. And then, there's more supporting evidence to, whether it be a file copy or file deletion, or they were sending this message. You may get a screenshot of the message, you may get some more information, but it's at the same time, you as a forensic analyst have to testify to what the computer told you. I can't speak for a third-party monitoring program, so at best you may have to bring somebody from their team to act as that SME as far as how they collect data. It opens up your case to another party. So I think that there's both risks and rewards to it. I think the biggest thing for me that this hybrid world has opened up is that that our partners and the software manufacturers who are working on the ways to collect data and process data, they've taken this because they had to, otherwise their tools don't work, and really have evolved. And I think that's the biggest thing for me in this space is evolution of data sources. I think the businesses, as they've evolved to hybrid, has become more complex in this entire forensics and e-discovery world, just because they're using more and more tools that are remote focused versus everything being behind a firewall, being very clear where your data sits. It's hard today to say my data sits in SharePoint. What does that mean? It could be in California, it could be in Chicago, it could be in Atlanta, who knows? But from a tool perspective, does it matter anymore? No, we still get it the same way.
So you've talked a lot today, and what's clear to me is it's only getting more complicated. There's only more information. So if I'm out there and I'm looking for a forensic analysis to partner with, what's that number one thing I need to ask to make sure I'm getting the right partner?
I think as a partner network, everybody has access to the same tools. They have access to the same training. They really have access to the same entire environment. So I think the biggest thing that you as a potential client or customer come across is it's going to be service focused, right? How engaged are they? How close to my team are they? Are they good consultants? Are they helping guide me through this maze of electronic evidence? As evidence continues to be more and more spread out, as the navigation of this data spectrum continues to become more complex, who has the best consultants? Who's willing to put the money behind their team to train them? That's to me is the biggest differentiator.
Yeah, and I would think the lawyer knows that they want to get here, but they don't know how to get there. So you need that consultant, that partner that's willing to say, I know in the past you got here this way, but we're dealing with different information or whatever, and now we want to try and go this way or that way.
Yeah, I mean, the best clients that I've ever worked with, they know exactly what they want, but they don't know how they get there from the electronic side. They know that there's communications, or they know that there's emails, or they know that there's some evidence, and they really rely on me or whoever their consultant is to help them to understand, here's what it is. This is the story that it tells me. You go back and now you make your case however you need to with the evidence you've been given. Maybe you need to change your strategy because the details of this and whatever you were originally thinking don't line up anymore. So I agree with you in that it really comes down to that service level, that consultativeness of your team that you're engaging with, because at the end of the day, they're practicing law, we're practicing the technology or the digital evidence side of it, and as a team, the better the team works, the better obviously the outcome would be.
All right, well, I can't thank you enough for all the time you've given us today. I do have one last question for you. It's hard to talk about digital forensics and not think about all the craziness that's on TV or in a Marvel movie and they're spinning and going through all that. So I'm just curious, what's the biggest myth that comes up in your world of talking about this that you'd like to say, yeah, that's just not how it works?
So, we made the CSI reference earlier, the NCIS, or any of the crime shows where they take a device, they hit go, and it gives them like an IP address. And I can't tell you how much it pains me to watch these shows because none of that's real. And most of the addresses they give you aren't even valid. So, I watch it with my wife and I cringe and she's like, what? And I said, it's just so unbelievable. It takes a significant amount of time to get to anywhere. And I think, I think that's the biggest myth is that it's solved and it's easy.
Right.
And we wouldn't exist if it was solved and easy.
I get that as a photographer and they pull up the image and they're like, zoom in, sharpen. I'm like, that's not how pixels work.
Right. Click a button and it's there.
Yeah. If you couldn't read the license plate from the original picture, you're not going to make it any better to be able to read it. So I totally get it. Once again, thank you so much for your time. This has been truly fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you again for listening to the podcast. To learn more about how IST can support your digital forensics needs, please visit our website at istmanagement.com.